This is East Fortune and the National Museum of Flight. Welcome to Scotland Unplugged and the tale of a record-breaking airship, a couple of stowaways, and the surprising healing power of chewing gum.
East Fortune Airfield, or Air Station, came into being in September 1915. The plan was to station airships here, patrolling sea lanes during World War I. The planes arrived later that month. The first big action was on the night of the 2nd of April 1916, when two Zeppelins dropped 23 bombs on Leith in Edinburgh.
Flight Sub-Lieutenant Cox took off to intercept them in an Avro 504C fighter. He couldn't find them because of the weather conditions, and when he came back to land, he crashed. It would be the beginning of a recurring theme.
In the Second World War, East Fortune served as a training station for RAF aircrew.
They were young, it was dangerous, there were a lot of crashes.
The site has seen a few uses over the years, with part of it being requisitioned as a sanatorium for tuberculosis sufferers, some Cold War activity, and a spell standing in for Edinburgh Airport. Eventually, people began to realise just how well preserved the site was.
It's actually a scheduled monument, with its original hangars, buildings, even blast shelters. The original First World War airfield was much bigger, with most of it being somewhere out there.
The Museum of Flight was set up in 1975. There's a civil aviation hangar, a military aviation hangar with a Spitfire, there's a Red Arrow, and then there's the jewel in the crown.
Concorde,
a commercial passenger jet capable of flying twice the speed of sound. Decommissioned in 2003 following a fatal crash in Paris in 2000, and the conclusion that it was just too inefficient to keep going.
It's hard to believe that once upon a time you could jump on a plane in London and be in New York 3 hours later.
Although typically it was more like 3.5.
I mean, no big deal.
And then hidden away, there's a plaque and some small, seemingly insignificant exhibits that pieced together tell a story.
On the morning of the 2nd of July 1919, a crew of 8 officers, 22 men, 2 emergency pigeons, and a couple of stowaways took off from here in the airship R34. Their mission? To complete the first direct flight between Britain and the USA. It would be the first east to west crossing of the Atlantic and the first return flight across that ocean.
The airship was 643 feet long, and the crew nicknamed her Tiny. It was built in the William Beardmore factory at Inchinnan near Glasgow and had a bow plate displaying a lion rampant with the words Pro Patria Volans emblazoned across it.
It translates roughly as to fly for your country.
It was a bit of a confusing setup, in a finding your feet kind of a way. R34 was the property of the Admiralty, but had an RAF crew. But some of them had come from the Army when the Royal Flying Corps preceded the RAF and had Army ranks. And some of them were wearing Navy uniforms.
The journey was hard going. It's difficult to imagine that now when you can tell where you are on the planet by looking at your phone, but their instruments, what they had, weren't too accurate. They couldn't always see the sea and the sky at the same time, or even tell how high they were if there was any kind of cloud cover.
When they hit heavy, sickly squalls that sent the ship up and down, they knew they could go higher, but they also knew that would mean dumping fuel, so they had to stick it out.
12 hours after takeoff, as they moved over the Atlantic, William Ballantyne, a rigger, was found stowing away.
He was a member of the crew, but he'd been taken off to make room for an American observer and didn't want to miss out on the journey. So he hid on board along with a tabby kitten called Wopsy, the ship's mascot. He'd climbed onto a girder between the gas bags. Rigid airships had gas bags inside them. The bit you can see on the outside was more of a shell. The crew slept inside the shell in hammocks, but if they fell out, they were over the envelope, and it was a long way down. Ballantyne was eventually overcome by leaking hydrogen.
Air Commodore Edward Maitland, the most senior aircraft man in the RAF, was on board and noted in his diary that if they hadn't been over water, they would have parachuted him to the ground.
As it was, they put him to work, cooking and pumping gas to the unreliable engines.
During the journey, one of their gas bags sprung a leak, and the only way they could repair it was with the crew's supply of chewing gum. I'm guessing they had to chew it first.
Then, as they neared Newfoundland and the coast of North America, they realised they were running low on fuel. They had three options. They could drop anchor and wait to be refueled by a destroyer. They could get pulled into land by another vessel, or they could make for Boston, which was closer. They chose Boston, and the ground crew headed off in that direction. Airships used extensive ground crews. When they left here, they'd had 150 of the Black Watch helping them out of the hangar. Then Major Scott, the commander of the ship, realised he could make New York.
They completed the outward leg, landing at Mineola on Long Island 108 hours and 12 minutes after leaving here. They had 1 hour's fuel left.
A crew member, Major John Pritchard, did wind up using a parachute when he had to jump to help the ground crew and became the first person to arrive in America by air. When they got there, they were a big deal. The airship had to be fixed, restocked and refueled. The crew met the president, Woodrow Wilson, and generally had the time of their lives. Ballantyne was sent home by ship and was off flight duties for a year, but Wopsy made the journey by air, despite a well-to-do woman offering to pay $1,000 for her. One of the emergency carrier pigeons flew off while being exercised and was picked up 800 miles away in the Atlantic.
Some groupies were rumoured to have planned to stow away, and someone threw a cask of rum into the cabin as they took off. All very rock and roll.
The return journey was decidedly smoother, with the crew arriving in Fulham and Norfolk after 75 hours.
And then the whole thing kind of fell into obscurity. Maybe partly because Alcock and Brown had crossed the Atlantic first, flying from Newfoundland to Ireland earlier in the same year in a Vickers Vimy biplane. Much newer tech than an airship.
In 1921, R34 was damaged in a storm and then broken up. Some of the crew, including Air Commodore Maitland, the man who'd logged everything, and Major Pritchard, the guy responsible for the pictures, were killed in an accident in another airship that same year.
And eventually, they erected this plaque. Some of the original aircrew were actually in attendance when it was unveiled. And now you can see some of what remains here. Pritchard's binoculars and the camera he used to take pictures of the crew. The same one that was used to photograph his own jump. The altimeter they could barely rely on, the crest from the nose cone. This is one of the blocks they used to moor the airships to. All reminders, like Concorde, like the Spitfire, like the crazy orange and red livery on the Comet jet over there. Touchstones from an era when flying was the future. In a world before endless security queues, full-body scanners and trays you have to empty your life into. It was a thing of glamour, something to be aspired to. A brave new world full of optimism and possibility.
And we can all use a bit of that.